The first hungry snowfall descended upon the Montana basin that year, a raw, biting cold that sent shivers through the horses and hastened the men's chores. It was the kind of chill that seemed to flay the very soul from one's bones, leaving it exposed to the merciless wind. The towering peaks of the Rockies, dusted in pristine white, stood like ancient silent witnesses, distant as a forgotten deity. No birds dared to sing, no streams dared to babble. Only the crisp crunch of frost beneath his boot soles served as a stark reminder to Reverend Silas Mercer that he remained a man, flesh and blood, though he often pondered if both had long since been stripped away. For 3 years, his voice had not resonated from a pulpit. The quaint chapel he once filled with fiery sermons and fervent prayers now stood desolate, its bell tongueless, its windows grimly boarded. The folk of Merrow Creek whispered of mercy when he departed. A mercy, they hissed behind his back like dry, rustling leaves, for a man who had worn the cloth while his transgressions festered and grew foul. He spoke of nothing. Not to the taciturn barkeep, nor to the grizzled old trappers at the trading post, who regarded him with the wary gaze reserved for bad omens. He procured his meager supplies, remained sequestered in his cabin nestled in the river's bend, and penned letters to no one, consigning them unread to the hungry maw of his stove. Sometimes when the profound darkness pressed relentlessly against the window panes, he prayed, not with uttered words, but with a deep, echoing silence, a silence far more truthful than any sermon he had ever delivered. That morning, Silas walked the riverbank, his old rifle slung loosely over his shoulder, the heavy ache of sleeplessness behind his tired eyes. The water, though rimmed with thin gray ice, had not yet succumbed entirely to winter's embrace. He had come to inspect his traps, but they lay empty, save for one twisted shut smeared with blood and fur that had not been there long. A coyote, perhaps, or something even gaunter. He turned to retrace his steps, his boots slipping on the treacherous frost, when he saw her. Initially, he mistook her for a discarded pile of ragged cloth, a forgotten child's doll, or some weary settler's lost belongings. Then a sudden shift in the wind revealed her hand, pallid and stiff, splayed against a smooth river stone, like a fragile starfish cast ashore. He dropped to one knee. She lay half submerged in the frigid current, her face turned to the ceaseless flow, dark, matted hair clinging to her cheek. A girl no more than 9 or 10.
She was shockingly light, like a sack of down feathers, and as cold as the very water from which she had emerged. She did not stir. He carried her back to the cabin, the snow hissing a low accompaniment beneath his boots. Inside, he gently laid her near the roaring fire, stoking the flames until they danced with wild, untamed abandon. He warmed cloths, pressing them against her icy skin. He spoke no words. He would not have known what to say. She bore no discernible mark of her origin, no bruises, no names stitched into her threadbare garments, only the profound, encompassing silence in her shallow, struggling breaths. When at last her eyelids fluttered open, her eyes with a haunting color of wet ash, watchful, possessing a wisdom far too ancient for her youthful face. She gazed at him, and something in her steady scrutiny tightened his throat. Not fear, not confusion, but the profound stillness one observes in wild creatures who have known an eternity of flight and pursuit. He knelt beside her, offering water in a dented tin cup. She accepted it with both hands, her small fingers trembling. When she attempted to speak, no sound materialized. Her mouth moved, but her voice was absent. "Mute," he murmured, the word crumbling like dry bread in his mouth. She flinched, almost imperceptibly. He tried again, his voice softer. "Can you write?" Nod for yes. She regarded him for a long moment, then slowly shook her head. He sighed, running a hand through his grizzled beard. "I reckon that's all right." That night, she sat curled by the hearth, enveloped in his old wool blanket, while he stirred beans over the crackling fire. She ate little, but her gaze never left him, not in fear, but as if awaiting something, he knew not what. Later, in his cot, he listened for her quiet breathing in the dark, and it was there, steady, undeniably real. Proof that something, indefinable yet profound, had returned to him. He closed his eyes, feeling the tangible weight of her presence in the small cabin. He had not truly prayed in years, but now he did, silent as the falling snow, uncertain for whom his supplication was intended, for her, perhaps, or for the long-dead part of himself. Outside, the river flowed relentlessly beneath its frozen veil, singing its soft, wordless hymn into the vast, indifferent night. The subsequent days unfolded as quietly as smoke. The girl he had chosen to call Wren, though she offered no flicker of recognition at the name, settled into his solitary world as if she had always been destined to inhabit it. Silas fashioned a bed for her in the loft, nestled above the stove's comforting warmth, where morning sunlight dappled through the narrow chinks in the roof. She never wept, not once, but sometimes he would find her gazing into the fire, as if deciphering ancient, forgotten secrets. There was no gentleness to her silence. It bore a profound weight that resonated with the aches in his old bones. One morning, he offered her a wooden spoon and gestured towards the bubbling pot. She tilted her head, then stirred with the meticulous patience of someone accustomed to getting things right the first time. Her hands, he observed, were remarkably nimble, devoid of scratches or scars, yet her nails were worn to the quick, and her fingers tensed involuntarily at sudden sounds. He refrained from asking from what river she had truly come, or who had permitted her to drift so perilously close to death. He possessed questions enough to fill volumes, but there was a sacred reverence in not pressing her. The world, he reasoned, had already taken far too much. Instead, he taught her how to split firewood with a wedge and maul, how to inspect the traps at dawn, how to expertly gut a fish without squandering a morsel of meat. She mirrored his every step, her boots salvaged from his deceased wife's belongings, patting softly upon the earth. When weariness claimed her, she would gently tug at his coat sleeve and point towards the cabin. She possessed a unique way of asking without uttering a sound, and he discovered an unexpected solace in its profound simplicity. One twilight, after the day's final chores were done, he sat by the fire, meticulously carving a length of pine. Wren watched from her quiet corner, chin resting upon her knees. He was sculpting a small bird, rustic and rounded, much like the sparrows that nested in the cabin's rafters. Without conscious thought, he extended it towards her. She accepted it slowly, cradling it in both hands, her thumb gently tracing its tiny wings. Then, with a suddenness that stole his breath, she smiled. It was small, crooked at one corner, as if she had almost forgotten the shape of joy, but it gleamed like the first thaw of spring,
and Silas felt an undeniable shift deep within his chest. Thereafter, she began to draw. Not with charcoal, which made her cough, but with pieces of charred wood from the fire. She would kneel by the hearth, meticulously sketching tiny, delicate images on scraps of paper or directly onto the cabin walls. A fox's keen face, a sentinel row of towering pines, the languid. Upon his return, snow-caked and aching, she awaited him at the edge of the tree line, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, the small wooden bird clutched fiercely in her fist. She would not release his coat until he rekindled the fire and uttered her name. "Wren," he said, a promise whispered into the cold air. Yet not all nights offered solace. Some she thrashed in her sleep, limbs tangled in blankets, breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. He never roused her. He simply sat nearby, stoked the fire, and waited until the tempest within her quieted. Then came the sound. It was long past midnight when he heard it, hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, a solitary rider. He rose, careful not to disturb Wren, and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hand. A man sat astride a bay mare, his face half obscured by a broad-brimmed hat, his oilskin coat gleaming faintly with frost. He did not dismount. "Evening, Reverend Mercer." The man's voice, low and gravel-worn, sliced through the night. Silas kept the rifle barrel pointed downwards, but his grip remained firm. "Ain't much for visitors." The man merely shrugged. "Ain't much for traveling, neither. Lost a trail near the ridge, thought I saw smoke." Silas glanced back. The chimney's plume rose straight and pale. "Ain't much here but river and pine. Sometimes that's all a man needs." Something in the stranger's tone pricked the hair on the back of Silas's neck. He nodded once. "You're welcome to rest your horse. Beyond that, I got nothing to offer." The man's smile was devoid of warmth. "Won't trouble you long." He dismounted, leading his mare to the lean-to without awaiting permission. Silas watched his movements, noting the eerie silence of his boots on the packed snow. Wren stirred behind the cabin door, and Silas instinctively stepped back inside, positioning his body as a barrier between her and whatever ill wind this visitor carried. Neither of them slept the remainder of that night. The stranger did not knock again, but by morning he was gone. The snow near the lean-to, however, bore the unmistakable imprint of someone who had stood watching through the dark hours. Wren stood by the window for a long while that day, her current drawing left unfinished. Trees shook off their brittle frost like old weary dogs, and the sky hung low, a heavy promise it had not yet decided to fulfill. Wren had begun to walk the riverbanks alone now, never straying beyond his sight, yet far enough to allow the wind to weave through her hair. She moved like a peaceful ghost, quiet and certain, her small wooden sparrow tied to a strip of leather around her neck. Sometimes she carried a stick tracing ephemeral shapes in the mud, perfect circles, pointed arrows, and once a crude yet recognizable map of their secluded valley. Silas observed from the cabin porch, rocking slowly, much as his father had done when the world demanded contemplation. He didn't inquire what she sought. Perhaps she sought nothing at all, merely remembering. Regardless, her silence no longer unsettled him. It possessed a rhythm now, a nuanced language he could almost decipher, yet the rider's visit gnawed at him. The man's face remained elusive in his memory, slippery as a half-forgotten dream, but his presence had left a chilling residue that clung even when the fire blazed fierce and hot. Silas checked his traps more frequently, kept his rifle meticulously cleaned and always within reach. He said nothing to Wren. There was no need. One morning, as the clouds parted in streaks of pale gold, Wren presented him with a bundle. Tied in a torn linen scrap, it contained a freshly gutted and cleaned squirrel. Her hand smelled faintly of pine pitch, and a quiet pride radiated from her shoulders as he looked down at the unexpected gift. "You did this?" he asked, a soft laugh escaping him. "Well, I'll be. I taught you too well." She held his gaze for a second longer than usual, then turned to hang her coat. Her steps had grown surer, and she no longer flinched at shadows as she once had. They ate the squirrel that night, simmered in a stew with the last precious onions he had managed to barter for. She ladled the broth with the solemnity of a sacred ceremony, and he allowed her. Later, as dusk painted the snow in hues of soft lavender, she handed him a new drawing. It depicted two figures beneath a towering pine tree, one tall, one small. Between them, a fire, and above it, a shape that could have been a bird or a flickering flame. He turned the paper over, but there was no name, no identifying mark. "Wren," he said, and she looked up. "I don't know who you are," he spoke slowly, "but I'm glad you're here." She did not smile. Instead, she reached out, not for the drawing or the fire, but for his calloused, rough hand. Her fingers slid over his knuckles and came to rest there, as if anchoring him to something he hadn't realized he had drifted from. He closed his eyes, holding that quiet, steadfast touch like it was a holy sacrament. That night, the storm truly broke. Not snow, but cold, relentless rain, thudding like furious hoofbeats on the cabin roof. Silas awoke to its deafening rhythm, and something more. The faint creak of wood, a subtle shift in the air. He sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle. Wren was already awake, crouched near the makeshift stairs, her eyes wide with an ancient knowing. She pointed silently towards the door. Lightning split the darkness, and for a fleeting instant, he saw the shadow beyond the window, a man's silhouette, tall and unnervingly still, watching. Then it vanished. He strode across the room, flung the door open. Nothing but rain and wind. No tracks yet, the ground a sodden canvas. But someone had stood there, close enough to touch the latch. He slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar across it. Wren had not moved. Her small fists were clenched tight. Silas knelt beside her. "You know him," he stated. She offered no verbal reply, but the way her eyes deepened with an old, weary knowledge, the way her shoulders involuntarily hunched, as if bracing for an inevitable blow, he had his answer. He built the fire higher, its flames licking hungrily at the logs. He sharpened his hunting knife to a razor's edge, then settled into his rocker, the rifle lying across his lap. Wren finally drifted into a fitful sleep, curled near the stove, the wooden bird at her throat rising and falling with each shallow breath. Rain beat against the world outside, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace held. Morning brought a deceptive calm, no fresh tracks, no new signs. But Wren refused to go to the river that day. She remained close,
drawing on the walls with charcoal, her strokes now faster, less precise, almost desperate. Silas watched her for a long time before he finally spoke. "You're not lost," he said, his voice quiet. "You're just not done yet." He wasn't sure if she comprehended, but she stopped drawing, walked over, and once more slipped her hand into his. And for the first time since that chilling December morning, he felt like a preacher again, not by title, not by trade, but in the profound way a man becomes a silent witness to something holy unfolding before him. By April, the river had shed its icy shackles and surged free, swollen and urgent. Birds returned in cautious, tentative flocks, their songs thin and filled with a curious hope. Patches of vibrant green crept across the valley, as if the very earth were slowly recalling itself. Wren grew taller, almost imperceptibly, without warning. One morning, her sleeves now hung short at her wrists. Silas observed her pressing seeds into the earth with a quiet, unwavering devotion. She performed every task with that same profound care, as if every small act held immense significance. The unwelcome visits resumed. First, a dead rabbit appeared on the porch, its throat cleanly slit, no sign of a predator. Then distinct footprints, deep and deliberate, circled the perimeter of the cabin. Silas set new traps, strung wire with tiny bells. He now slept in his boots, the rifle always within reach. Wren spoke nothing of it, but her drawings shifted to only birds, mostly ravens, their wings always outstretched, never at rest, always mid-flight. Then came the rider again. This time he did not conceal himself in shadow. He arrived in broad daylight, leading his mare with the proprietary air of a man returning to a place he still claimed as his own. Silas stood firm on the porch, Wren a silent breath behind him, a breath he dared not take. The man halted 20 feet away, tipping his hat with a mocking gesture. "Reverend Mercer," he said, his voice carrying clearly on the crisp air. "I heard you died." "Nearly," Silas retorted, his voice low and steady. "Not quite." The stranger offered a thin, knowing smile, and Wren clutched tighter at Silas's coat. "Nice cabin," the man drawled. "Shame it's so far from town." Silas remained unmoving. "You come for the girl." The man's eyes flicked briefly to the small figure behind Silas, then back to the Reverend's face. "She's not yours," Silas stated. "She's not yours either. She's under my roof." The stranger dismounted, slowly, deliberately, like a man unholstering a pistol in the solemnity of a church. "You know what happens to folks who keep what don't belong to them." Silas raised his rifle. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "She yours now, preacher? Is that how you redeem yourself?" "I'm not looking for redemption," Silas replied, his voice firm. They stood locked in this tense tableau, two men scarred by different sins, while Wren pressed closer to the warmth radiating from Silas's back. Then the man spat contemptuously into the dirt and turned. "You're making this harder than it has to be." He mounted his horse, riding away without another word.